This relationship is at the same time the limit at which the self-contained life of the family breaks up and goes beyond itself. The brother is the member of the family in whom its spirit becomes an individuality which turns towards another sphere and passes over into the consciousness of universality. The brother leaves this immediate, elemental, and therefore, strictly speaking, negative ethical life of the family in order to acquire and produce the ethical life that is conscious of itself and actual. This short paragraph, number 458, is bringing to a close the discussion of the family that's been going on in the last two paragraphs and talking about this brother-sister relation that was discussed primarily in the last paragraph, and now preparing for the role that the brother is going to play and further specifying the relations between family and community or human and divine laws. So Hegel talks in terms of this being a limit, this relationship being a limit between the self-contained life of the family, where the self-contained life breaks up and goes beyond itself, extrudes itself, you might say, into the larger environment of the community. And we could also look at this as a border. Grenze can have that sense as well. So who is doing that? We already have the father going out there and doing the same thing that now the brother is going to be doing. So here Hegel concentrates on this younger man, the brother, the member of the family, he says, in whom spirit becomes an individuality not just within the family, but also vis-a-vis the larger community. And then this individuality turns towards another sphere, passes over into the consciousness of universality. This is a very abstract way of talking, and what Hegel is describing here is essentially what we call coming of age and going out to, earn a living, to participate in the larger society. This happens by stages, of course, in most cases. But we see it in fairy tales where the hero goes out to, into the wide world to earn his living and is often just cast out. Now, Hegel is also going to talk about this universality as being a move from the negative ethical life of the family, and we'll talk about why that's the case in further paragraphs, in order to acquire and produce the ethical life that is conscious of itself and actual, and that is to be found here in the community. He passes from the divine law within whose sphere he lived over to human law, but the sister becomes, or the wife remains, the head of the household and the guardian of the divine law. In this way, the two sexes overcome their merely natural being and appear in their ethical significance, as diverse beings who share between them the two distinctions belonging to the ethical substance. These two universal beings of the ethical world have therefore their specific individuality in naturally distinct self-consciousnesses, because the ethical spirit is the immediate unity of the substance with self-consciousness. An immediacy which appears, therefore, both from the side of reality and of difference, as the existence of a natural difference. It is that side which, in the shape of individuality that is real to itself, showed itself in the notion of spiritual being as an originally determinate nature. This moment loses the indeterminateness which it still has there and the contingent diversity of dispositions and capacities. It is now the specific antithesis of the two sexes whose natural existence acquires at the same time the significance of their ethical determination. Paragraph 459 begins by talking a little bit more about this passing, this moving from one range of things or one law to another on the part of the brother. But then it starts to elaborate this fundamental difference or distinction that's happening within spirit, within human beings and their relations with each other and the meanings that they find. And this is going to be tied in partly with sexual difference, but not reducibly to merely sexual difference enshrined, say, in culture or in the continuance of families. So he says the brother passes from the divine law within whose sphere he lived, that is, he grew up within a family, to human law. He becomes part of the larger community. But the sister remains behind. The sister becomes, or the wife remains. And so here we're now talking about roles, sister and wife, brother or husband. We're talking about something that's going on generationally, right? They remain the head of the household and the guardian of the divine law. In a certain sense, they are deprived of a possibility, that is, of going out and becoming part of this larger community, finding themselves within the larger community in relation to other individuals in the larger community governed by the human law. But within the household, they reign supreme. They are able to further develop something else. You might say develop in a different direction that we're going to see discussed a bit more in the paragraphs yet to come. So this is going to be identified with gender or sex, however you want to put it. I don't want to get too bogged down into the many different distinctions that people make in the present about this, although that would be an interesting subtopic to explore some other time. So he goes on and he says, in this way, the two sexes overcome their merely natural being and appear in their ethical significance. That is a key point to Hegel's treatment of male and female, or man and woman, in this section, and indeed, I would argue, throughout the entire work and in his social theory more broadly. The relation between male and female, or man and woman, male and female sort of like understood in a generic sense, man and woman understood as specific individualities, as concrete people, cannot be reduced, at least if it's going to retain its spiritual significance, merely to sexual characteristics, or even to what it is that the larger culture or the ongoing family says, well, this is men and this is women and this is what they do, There's an ethical significance here that Hegel wants to highlight as always perhaps in danger of being lost, but very important to continually bring up. So he says, these two universal beings of the ethical world. Notice that he doesn't say, the female is lost in particularity, universality is over here. These are both universal. These universal beings of the ethical world have, he says, their specific individuality in naturally distinct self-consciousnesses. Naturally distinct self-consciousnesses, how are they naturally distinct? Well, through sexual difference, and also through the differentiation thereby of role, which is taking place in part through culture and in part through culture's reverberations within the family and then reinterpretation within the matrix of that much closer relationship, right? But this is not, the end of the story, this naturally distinct self-consciousness. Why not? He goes on and he says, the ethical spirit is the immediate unity of the substance with self-consciousness. Again, a very abstract way of talking about this. What does he mean by saying something like, ethical spirit is immediate unity of the substance with self-consciousnesses? When we have an individual self-consciousness that is understanding itself in relation to others and in an ethical way, within, we might say, an ethical framework, it is in a certain way united with, and perhaps in an uncomfortable manner, with the ethical substance, with the mores, with the customs and laws, right? And it could be the law of the human community, it could be the divine law. So he says, what we have here is an immediacy, right, which appears both from the side of reality and of difference as the existence of a natural difference. So we begin with a natural difference, a natural distinction, if we want to say. There's some slipping back and forth between these. Unterschied, a splitting, a separation of man and woman, of male and female. of sister and brother going on within this. And notice that he says that this is appearing as the existence of a natural difference, as something we can take for granted. Now notice that he's saying that it appears both from reality and from the difference. That's a strange way to talk about that, isn't it? What is he just being, extra wordy? Is he, engaging in a kind of pleonasm here? No. There's something that's being thought out from within the difference itself, as well as the reality, the realität, the situation that they're in. He goes on and he says, it's that side which in the shape of individuality that is real to itself, remember we looked at this much earlier, showed itself in the notion of spiritual being as an originally determinate nature. This is something we explored previously. The moment, he says, loses the indeterminateness which it still has there and the contingent diversity of dispositions and capacities. It's now the specific antithesis instead of something different of the two sexes, of the two genders, each with their sphere, each with their roles, each with their own role to play within this drama that's playing out. He says they acquire at the same time the significance of their ethical determination. So it can't just be, I'm a man because I have the phallus and, everybody marks me semiotically as a man, so I behave in that way. And I get certain privileges, and I maybe don't have to do things over here in the household, and I get to go out here. And somebody else says, well, I don't have that marker, so I'm stuck here in the household, but at least I get to be in charge of that. No, it goes beyond that, according to Hegel. There's something more going on there. So what is that? Well, we still have to work that out. The difference of the sexes and their ethical content remains, however, in the unity of the substance, and its movement is just the constant becoming of that substance. The husband is sent out by the spirit of the family into the community in which he finds his self-conscious being. Just as the family in this way possesses in the community its substance and enduring being, so conversely the community possesses in the family the formal element of its actual existence, and in the divine law its power and authentication. Neither of the two is by itself absolutely valid. Human law proceeds in its living process from the divine, the law valid on earth from that of the netherworld, the conscious from the unconscious, mediation from immediacy, and equally returns whence it came. The power of the netherworld, on the other hand, has its actual existence on earth. Through consciousness it becomes existence and activity. In paragraph 460, Hegel is now going to add a little bit more about the relationship between these two spheres, how they fit into each other. And he reminds us at the very beginning that the difference of the sexes and their ethical content, he says, remains in the unity of the substance, the unity of the ethical substance, the unity of spirit as it is working itself out. And so he says, and its movement is just the constant becoming of that substance. This is something that is worth emphasizing because we're going to see this playing itself out in just a few more paragraphs when Hegel talks about justice. It's very important to see that any sort of substance, in order to remain dynamic, is going to have not just an equilibrium, but disequilibrium going on. You can only have progress and development, or even a continuous, progression, if there is something that winds up slipping out of gear, you might say. And so Hegel is sketching out for us in this paragraph how these two are connected with each other. And he begins by talking in terms kind of similar to what he did in 2 paragraphs back, focusing on the male who leaves the family, doesn't, become totally disconnected from it, but who exits it, who crosses that border into the world of the community, the world of sort of self-conscious and actual spirit. And so he talks about the husband in this case, no longer the brother, but the husband, going out into the community, and as he puts it, being sent out by the spirit of the family into the community, in there finding his self-conscious being. Now, why does he go out into the community? There may be many reasons. Hegel doesn't go into them here, but we could think, for example, of economic reasons, the need to trade, the need to sell wares, the need to labor for wages. It might also be for political representation. It might also be for other things, the ways in which families are connected to each other, going to visit another male head of a household in a different family, the whole notion of gift exchange in the past. All of those could be operative here. In any case, the husband is going out and is finding his self-conscious being in the community. Why? Because that's the locus where that sort of thing happens. Now, Hegel sketches out two other things that are going on. First, he talks about the family itself, not just the husband, but the family itself getting something out of its relationship with the community. He says, in this way, the family has in the community its substance and enduring being. It is the family, for example, of this guy who people know on account of him being out there in the community. And then he has children, and he has a spouse, and he has mother and father as well, and whatever we want to talk about in terms of the generations and the structure of the family. So the family is gaining a sort of recognition in the community through sending the father or the other male, like the brother, out into the community. Is the community getting anything out of it itself? Well, you could say, hey, with no families, no community. We've already talked about this quite a bit. The family, at least as understood in most traditional social theories, is a basic unit that is a component of the larger community. The community is not reducible to families, but without families, no real community. And Hegel is saying something like that here, but he's adding something to that. He says, conversely, the community has in the family the formal element of its actual existence. Now that's an interesting way to frame it. The formal element of its actual existence, right? Without there being families, again, there is no community, right? There is no existing community. Now, he also says, in the divine law, the community finds its power, its Kraft, and its authentication, or if you like, its testing, its verification, Bewährung. Without that aspect, there's something that ends up being missing. You can't have, for Hegel at this point, a community which is going to be radically separated off from what is happening in the family. You can't have a purely human law without some sort of divine law that is providing it with its basis, you might say. So he goes on and he says, neither of the two is by itself absolutely valid. Human law proceeds in its living process from the divine. This doesn't mean that human law proceeds from the divine by receiving a divine revelation and everyone's saying, okay, now we have to go from there. No, you could say that it takes its cues or it meets its limitations in the divine law. And that's the way it's going to play out as we move into these further sections, right? So he says the law valid on earth proceeds from that of the netherworld. Here's where it gets really interesting. The conscious from the unconscious. Mediation from immediacy. And equally returns whence it came. So he says a little bit further, the power of the netherworld has actual existence on earth. How? Through the community. Through its eruption, you might say, into the community. Through consciousness, it becomes existence and activity. And that means that unless it does actually rise to the level of consciousness, which means that it has to become part of the public, it's not fully what it is. It's just sort of churning away in a subterranean manner. We love these sorts of chthonic metaphors for the unconscious ever since the time of Freud, right? But there's really something to that. So these two sides are going to be connected with each other, the conscious to the unconscious. And it's not going to be possible for the human to totally take over in contradistinction to the divine. The universal ethical beings are then the substance qua universal and the substance qua an individual consciousness. Their universal actuality is the nation and the family, while they have their natural self and operative individuality in man and woman. In this content of the ethical world, we see achieved those ends which the previous insubstantial forms of consciousness set themselves. What reason apprehended only as object has become self-consciousness, and what the latter possessed only within itself is now present as a true objective reality. What observation knew as a given object in which the self had no part is here a given custom, but a reality which is at the same time the deed and work of the subject finding it. The individual who seeks the pleasure of enjoying his individuality finds it in the family, and the necessity in which that pleasure passes away is his own self-consciousness as a citizen of his nation. Or again, it is in knowing that the law of his own heart is the law of all hearts, in knowing the consciousness of the self as the acknowledged universal order. It is virtue, which enjoys the fruits of its sacrifice, which brings about what it sets out to do. That is, to bring forth the essence into the light of day, and its enjoyment is this universal life. Finally, consciousness of the matter in hand itself finds satisfaction in the real substance, which contains and preserves in a positive manner the abstract moments of that empty category. That substance has in the ethical powers a genuine content that takes the place of the insubstantial commandment which sound reason wanted to give and to know, and thus it gets an intrinsically determinate standard for testing, not the laws, but what is done. Hegel is doing two main things in this somewhat longish paragraph 461. So first he talks about the universal ethical being that he's just been sketching out in terms of the family and the community, the divine law, the human law, how they intersect with each other, how both of them need each other, both of them are the full expression of spirit and yet are not completely the entire show. So he goes on and he talks about the universal ethical beings, and he makes another distinction here that's very important. So they are the substance qua universal and the substance qua an individual consciousness. They are present as both. And you might think all the way back to the very first substantive section of the Phenomenology, where we explored sense certainty, and we arrived at the universal, and then we moved into the perception and the universal, the thing and its qualities. All of this has been leading up to this. We are now at the point where we can see what he's calling the universal actuality of these universal ethical beings as being the family and the nation. But there's also an individuation that's taking place that is just as important. And why is that so important? Because the family as such and the nation as such doesn't actually do anything. We often talk in terms of these universals, these wholes that are composed of parts, but it's the parts that are actually doing the acting. The whole exists precisely because of the reality of its parts. So when we're talking about the parts of things like a family or a community, we're talking about human beings. And those human beings have natural selves. In this case, we've been talking primarily about distinctions between sexes, right, male and female. But they also have all sorts of other particularities as well, which could come into play. So he goes on and he says, in this content of the ethical world, we're going to see achieved those ends which the previous insubstantial forms of consciousness set themselves. Here's the second thing that's going on. What we went through in the reason section, particularly once we got out of observing reason and we got into practical reason, right, where the real story is going on, quite frankly, what we had were forms of consciousness, gestalten, right? And those are now going to find their realization here in what's taking place in this spirit section. So he charts this out for us. And notice that there aren't really, there are parallelisms going on, but they're not completely parallel. He says, we start out with, pleasure and necessity. The individual who seeks the pleasure of enjoying his individuality finds that within the family, and then the necessity in which that pleasure passes away is his own self-consciousness as a citizen of the nation. You have to subordinate the pleasure that one could be taking just within the confines of the family to some larger task, right? Now, if we back up a little bit in this paragraph, he says, what reason knew as a given object in which the self had no part is here a given custom, but a reality that is at the same time the deed and work of the subject finding it. This is again still the subject, the self-consciousness trying to work out for itself the very meaning of its existence. What about the law of the heart? Well, you remember the law of the heart went into the frenzy of self-conceit. That's not being talked about here. Instead, Hegel talks about moving from the law of one's own heart to the law of all hearts, knowing that the law of his own heart is the law of all hearts, knowing that the consciousness of the self as the acknowledged universal order. So we don't have the frenzy that's going on there, the tearing apart, the zerrissen. And then he talks about virtue, and he says, it's virtue which enjoys the fruits of its sacrifice. You remember that in the virtue and the way of the world section, virtue did not enjoy the fruits of its sacrifice. Instead, what happened is virtue was revealed as somewhat of a sham, as not really able to take on the way of the world that it ought to have been able to address. So perhaps what we're seeing here is a recuperation and a context providing for these three dynamics. Then Hegel goes on and he talks about what ended up being the key thing for the last section of reason from the spiritual animal kingdom on, the matter in hand, right? Or the heart of the matter, it was also how it was translated, the Sache selbst. I've been translating it as the project, right? And what he says here is that instead of having something that turns out to be essentially empty, right? The consciousness of the matter in hand finds satisfaction. Where? In the real substance, which contains and preserves in a positive manner the abstract moments of that empty category. What it was reaching for through all those dynamics and was unable to find, particularly in the last two things, in giving itself laws and testing those laws, turns out not to be what it was really all about. What it's about now is the real ethical substance. So he says that substance has in the ethical powers, what are the ethical powers? Again, family, nation, woman, man, has in these a genuine content that takes the place of the insubstantial commandments which sound reason wanted to give and know. So what do we conclude here? It gets an intrinsically determinate standard for testing, not the laws, but what is done. What is done? What is done are the customs that are being replicated over and over again from generation to generation, and the innovations that are also taking place in the relations between people, discovering who they are, not just by themselves, but engaged with others in the larger ethical sphere of the nation or the community, however we want to frame it. So all of these previous stages, they were indeed something that was at that stage, something real, something determinate. We can read them into people's lives at historical periods, but they also had a greater meaning and greater purpose, which is now being realized here as they are sublated, aufgehoben, into these ethical beings of this section.